Hey everybody, I'm Spudnut. Welcome to another episode of Gaming Spiders. Welcome back everybody. On today's episode of Gaming Spiders, I'm going to show you this Mandalorian nativity scene that I found online. I'm going to start by showing you where I found the files and outline some of the challenges with some of the files. Then I will talk about how I painted these and any of the issues that I had in 3D printing them. So let's get right to the episode and where I found the files.
All right, everybody, the next thing I want to do is show you where I found the files for this print. It came from Thingiverse, and if you go into Thingiverse and search for Mandalorian nativity scene, this file will pop up. This is the Mandalorian Baby Yoda Christmas manger scene that was put on here by rawlogic. Here's an overview of all of the files that come and the suggested setup. As you'll see, it's a little bit different than the one that I did. First and foremost, there are two dewbacks here. What I noted is that it's the same print, simply reversed, and I didn't want two of the exact same models, so I only decided to print one. Second thing is, on the right hand side here, there is a bantha. I really didn't like this model, and so I decided to replace this with a blurg, which I thought was more appropriate from the show, and so I simply searched Thingiverse for a blurg, found a good model, and then resized it to fit for the size of the Mandalorian. Other than that, I used the bulk of these files with the exception of a couple of things that I will point out. So when you come here, you'll note that the majority of the items from this scene are actually individual files that have been put together to create this one grouping of files, and rawlogic puts a link to most of the files that he used to create this in the list below, so you can check to see where those original files are coming from. And what you need to do is download all the files onto your computer and import them into a slicer. In my case, I use Cura, and I'm printing on a Creality Ender 3 Pro using a 0.40mm nozzle. What you'll find when you download the files is that there's multiples of each file. So I'll give you an example. There are easy print versions and detailed versions. So I decided to go with the detailed versions, and you can see here the detailed version of R5D4. But if you're concerned about the quality of your prints, also included are easy print versions that do not have as much detail. These would definitely print a lot easier on a filament printer, but they look a little bit too cartoony to me, so I decided to go with the detailed versions. There are a few of them that I encountered issues printing, so this is one of them. On my Ender 3 Pro, it printed pretty well, but some of these really fine details like the antenna and some of these knobs up top here did not print out. So you just have to be aware of that. I was also using a 0.4mm nozzle. I could have gone down to a 0.2 and probably got some of the details, but I didn't want to change the nozzle for this print. The other item that I did not print as part of this set is up the blaster. So there's a blaster that comes that is supposed to sit next to the Cara Dune figure. I tried it a couple of times and the details were just too fine for the settings that I had, even though I tried orientating it different ways on the print bed. And in the end, I decided to leave it out anyway because it isn't really necessary. This figure has a small blaster in her hand, and so I didn't think it was necessary to complete the scene. So the last model that I had issue printing was the Porgs. Here's the low-res version and then the high-res version. For whatever reason, when I opened the file in Cura, they all wanted to print at the same time, and I was having issue orienting them in the print bed. So I did not print out the version of the Porgs that come with this set of files. I just searched Thingiverse for Porgs, found 3 different models, and then I had to resize them. And then I printed them each individually, and that seemed to work. So as I said, yeah, all you need to do is come here, download your STL files, get them into your computer, put them into a slicer that matches your printer settings. If you've got a resin printer, obviously you're going to be able to get a lot more of the detail. But for me, the detail was just fine on my filament printer, and so that's what I'll do next, is show you the results of the prints and how I painted them up.
All right, so the next thing I want to do is go through each of the individual pieces in this set just to show you how I painted them and outline any issues that I had with the prints. Just a disclaimer up front, I am not a professional painter. In fact, I painted one of my first minis really last year, and so I'm sure there's many of you out there that can do a much better job painting these than I can. Also, I don't have an airbrush. These are all painted with acrylic paints and a paintbrush using cheap dollar store paints, so I don't even have very good materials to paint with. But for a first attempt, I thought they were okay, and so I'll run through these, including how I did the paint jobs and, as I said, any of the issues with the prints. So this first one here is the dewback, and this was a relatively simple print with supports, no issues. From a paint job perspective, I just used a couple of different shades of green, and then I used a tan on the bottom and some browns for the saddle. I do use washes. They're handmade, that I picked up the recipes off of YouTube, and so that helps to blend them a little bit. So that's the dewback. The next one is the blurg. Almost a similar paint scheme as the dewback, but in this case I used a couple of shades of gray as opposed to the greens. Little bit of an issue setting up the print on this one for these saddle handles on top. The supports did not want to fit in there, and so I had to fiddle with it a little bit in Cura just to get the supports right before I printed, but once I got that, worked out pretty well. So other than that, no issues with this print. Worked out pretty easy to remove the supports because there's lots of room underneath this model to get them out. Another simple print were the bales, and there's 2 different models, and so because of the 2 different models, I decided to paint them 2 different colors. I used a yellow paint scheme on this one with some white dry brushing, and on this one a green with some white dry brushing. I printed out 2 sets, one for each side of the structure. Next up is this backpack. Some pretty good detail on this one. I think I printed this one in some higher detail settings in Cura with the same nozzle, the 0.4 nozzle, but I just increased the quality a little bit in the settings, and then used a couple of different shades of brown with some white dry brushing and a brown wash to finish this one off. Because this one lays flat, again, no issues with printing, and I didn't need to use supports. Couple of pieces here from the background. This one is just a small sack, a basic tan paint job with a brown wash, and then this sack of grain. I think it's supposed to be corn. Both again easy prints, no supports needed. This one I used a yellow paint job with a white dry brush, and then a brown and an orange wash just to get some of the highlights on the grain. Next up is probably the one I'm least happy about, and that's R5D4. I mentioned this in the files. This one is missing some of the details. I don't have the antenna on the top here, and there's a few of these knobs that didn't print out really well. But other than that, most of the other details showed up. But from a paint job perspective, I really struggled with this one. I find it difficult anytime you're painting something primarily white, and I didn't take the time to mask off most of these areas, so it's all freehand, and you can tell that this is my most challenging paint job. It's okay, but if I had an option, I would probably repaint this one a little bit more carefully. Next up, we have what's supposed to be the Cara Dune figure. There is no Cara Dune model on Thingiverse, and so I think Raw Dog used what was available, and so this is actually a fantasy elf laying on a mat, and then the head was replaced with a stormtrooper helmet. It doesn't perfectly fit Cara Dune, obviously, because she doesn't wear a stormtrooper helmet, and also the hair on this model is quite long, so that also doesn't match. But it was what's in the set, so it was what I decided to print out. Tried to match some Cara Dune colors, and I did have to print this stormtrooper helmet separately. There is one that comes in the file, but for whatever reason in Cura it did not want to print. So this model printed without a head, and then I went onto Thingiverse and found a separate file for a stormtrooper helmet, resized it for the size of the model, and then printed it out separately, and then just glued it on. Seems to have worked okay, and looks basically the same as the model looked anyway. So a bit of a challenge with that one. Another one of the paint jobs that I'm not super happy about, but it'll do. All right, next I want to talk about these boots. These sit next to Cara Dune, and I'm pretty happy that these were included in the scene just because the Cara Dune figure does not have boots on. The only thing I'll say about these is that they are a little bit big, and so I probably should have resized them for her feet, but they're close enough that you don't really notice. From a paint job perspective, just a black paint job with a simple gray dry brush. And those are done. Next up we have the logs and the porgs. The logs are a separate print, and I just printed out 5 of them because that's what was shown. And then, as I mentioned in the files on Thingiverse, I didn't use the original Porg settings that came with it. For whatever reason, they didn't want to print out properly. So what I did was I went and found some new Porg models on Thingiverse, and they were quite large, so I had to shrink them down to what I thought was the appropriate size. Printed them all out separately, and then I glued them to these logs just because they're so light, and they're a little, this one in particular that's standing is a little off balance. So by gluing them on the logs, it just provides them with some added stability so that they don't fall over. And they're still really light, so I think this just adds a little bit more weight that allows them to sit better when they're sitting in the scene. Okay, the last 2 here. This is the Baby Yoda and the Pram. These are 2 separate prints. In fact, 3 separate prints because the stand is a separate print as well. I decided after I painted it up to glue the Baby Yoda into this Pram just because, again, it doesn't sit in there that well unless it's glued in. The detail on this one wasn't too bad. I had to angle it a little bit on the print bed just to be able to print it with the supports and still get the detail on the front. So the back is a pretty rough, but that was okay because I knew I wasn't going to see it anyway. And the Pram I basically printed upright so that I didn't have to have any supports on the interior. So it's all about orientation on the print bed. Other than that, it turned out pretty good. And now we'll get to the final piece. Okay, last but certainly not least from the figure standpoint is the Mandalorian. This is actually the figure that I printed out first, just because I wanted to make sure that it was going to work on my Creality Ender 3 Pro. And everything kind of hinged around having this figure in the scene. So if this one didn't work, I wasn't going to be able to do the rest of the scene. I did print this one on higher quality settings with the 0.4 nozzle just because I wanted some of the details to show up. And I did have to change the orientation of the print. So I wanted to make sure that the blaster rifle was supported, and so I actually printed it with the rifle basically parallel to the print bed, so the figure was on an angle like this. Seems to have worked really well. It was a little bit difficult getting some of the supports out from behind the upper part of the cape here, but in the end I was able to get them all out. You'll see from the paint job here that I used the paint job from episode 1 of The Mandalorian. Specifically chose that one because it's the first episode where the Mandalorian meets Baby Yoda, and I also like that there's quite a bit of variability in the armor as opposed to the later Beskar armor that's all silver. So it allowed for a little bit more of a dynamic paint job, and I like the fact that I got a lot of the blaster marks and things in here. This was a bit of a challenging paint job for me, and again, it's the first figure that I actually painted just because I knew that if I couldn't paint this one to look right, the whole thing wouldn't look very good. So I spent quite a bit of time on this one. It's the one I'm the most proud of, and I think it turned out pretty good. So that's the Mandalorian. So that's all the figures. The last thing to talk about is the structure itself. All of the parts of this are individually printed: the floor, the sides, the back wall, and the 3 different roof pieces. They all have flat sides, so they print relatively easy without the need for supports. For this, I wanted to keep the paint job relatively simple. So for the back wall and the sides, I just used gray paint with a light gray dry brush and a black wash, with the exception of the Imperial style window at the back here that I painted black. For the floor, it's a gloss black, although it doesn't really show up too glossy in the camera. And then for the roof, a bronze paint job with the silver skull. I wanted to keep the colors relatively muted on this one so that the rest of the pieces in the scene would stand out, and I think that worked out pretty good. Everything is glued together. Just from a stability standpoint, it worked out a lot better. These roof pieces just sit loosely on here, and so they are prone to fall off if it gets bumped. So I just glued everything together. Overall, this scene looks really well against these colors, and so I wouldn't get too crazy in terms of putting bright colors on this, as it'll take away from the rest of the scene. So that's the structure that it all sits around, and the next thing I'm going to do is put it all back together again just so you can see the final scene, and I'll switch to that now. Alright, here is the final assembled scene, the Mandalorian Nativity scene. And like I said, pretty good detail. Changed it up a little bit with the blurg and a few of the other pieces that I didn't do, but overall pretty happy with the way this one turned out. So if you're interested in getting one of these, you can go to Thingiverse, download your own, and print it out. If you do, would love to hear how it goes. And for any of you that have taken the time to watch this, just want to say thanks for joining me. And if you liked the video, smash that like button, hit subscribe. And until next time, good gaming.